I appreciate Wes leading those songs that he led, and several of those, it's almost like he read my outline, talking about this last song, talking about the trust and the faith, and we thinking about earlier as the first combination of songs that involved the peace and the nearness to God and how that provides us with stability. It has been a wild 9 months since the pandemic situation started. And I know a lot of people were so excited for 2020 to end, and that I think some people felt like there was just going to be this magic switch that was going to flip on January 1st, 2021, and things were just going to be better all of a sudden somehow. Well, that's not the way life works, and it's certainly not the way this worked. And instead, we've had continued troubles and even chaos on in a governmental level this past week erupted, and a lot of those things can be very troubling for us. And so this morning I wanted to take the time to talk to us about our trust issues and ask the question, do you have trust issues? Now that could mean a lot of things. It can mean, do you have issues not trusting those that you should? Or it could mean that you have difficulty with trusting those that you shouldn't. But we want to look at what the Scriptures have to say, and we're certainly not going to exhaust this topic by any means, but just wanted to look at a few things that the Scriptures have to say about our trust and what we should trust and what we shouldn't trust. Someone who lived through a much darker time than we have, Corrie ten Boom, who lived through the Nazi occupation of Holland, and her family helped to hide some of the Jews from the Nazis. And eventually they themselves were captured for doing that and thrown into a prison camp. Her sister died in that prison camp. And she survived and eventually was freed from it and lived on for many years talking about what it was like to live through those times that are certainly far worse than anything that people in the past year have been experiencing here. But she said this about that experience and others: never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. That's certainly true. We don't know what the future holds. But we can know, as the song says, who holds the future, and that He holds us in His hand. And so as we face this year, already off to a rocky start, I saw some jokes, but I think some people really felt that way. That after 5 days of the new year, they said, well, it was a good 5 days, and then it's with violence in the Capitol and things like that. On the 6th day, they said, it was a good 5 days, maybe 2022 will be better. And so they were already ready to throw the whole year away and give up on it. And I hope we're not in that boat. But certainly when troublesome times come and we are uncertain about what's going to happen in the future, we don't know what the rest of this year holds. Will it get better? Will it get worse? Will it stay the same? What will change? We just don't know. And so because of that, we simply have to put our trust and faith in God. But I wanted us to start really with looking at something that I would refer to as trust that causes rust. Trusting in the wrong things causes worry, it causes anxiety, it causes also destruction And it causes our soul to just decay away and rust, in a sense. Because if we've put our faith in all of the wrong things, then when those things disappear or fade away or are lost, we have nothing left to put our faith in and to put our trust in. And so the scriptures warn us about several things that people have a tendency to trust. And again, this isn't even an exhaustive list. And some of it, because it was written so long ago, their trusts, the specific things mentioned, may be a little different than the things that we might feel tempted to trust in. But some of them will be similar. Job 15:31 warns us not to trust in vanity, vain things, empty things. Job 39:11 talks about trusting an ox. Well, the old King James said a unicorn. I sure wouldn't trust a unicorn. That sharp horn might hurt you. But an ox, do you trust that ox? Do you put your faith in that ox? And we might today say something more like a tractor. The pesticides and fertilizers and different things that our farmers use to produce food. Or do we put our trust in that? Because that's not something that's solid. That can be done away with. There were times throughout the history of the world where there have been famines and there have been crop failures due to either hail or pests like locusts or something like the Dust Bowl that happened back before the Great Depression that helped bring those events on and make them even worse. There are a lot of factors. Flooding can wash those things away. There are a lot of factors that affect farming. We can't just put our faith in the farming that takes place. Psalm 20 and verse 7 mentions chariots and horses. Now, I dare say I know a few that have some horses, but I don't know anybody that's got chariots. But what is he really talking about if you look at the context and consider the world they lived in? Chariots and horses were basically war machinery. We might say today, tanks and missiles. Are we going to put our faith and our trust in the U.S. military to keep us safe and protect us? It's not powerful enough. If God decides to go against us, there's no power militarily on earth. In a similar way, Psalm 44 and verse 6 mentions the bow and the sword. And the psalmist says, I will not trust in my bow or my sword to save me. Again, we cannot trust in those things. Psalm 62 and verse 10 mentions oppression. You know, there are those who trust in their might and their power to hold others under their thumb, to keep them under their heel of their boot, to keep them down and oppress them and gain from that oppression. And that too is something that is not going to hold up. In Isaiah 30 and verse 12, along with oppression, it mentions perverseness. Because to oppress another human being who's created in the image of God takes a certain level of perverseness. And to think that by pushing others down, we can actually be lifting ourselves up is a perverse idea and a perverse thought. Psalm 146 and verse 3 warns us not to put our trust in princes. Well, we don't have princes in this country. I mean, there was that guy Prince before he changed his name and then changed it back, and he sang songs, and I hope people didn't put a lot of trust in him. But what were the princes? Well, the princes were basically the ruling elite. They weren't the king himself, but they were his sons and the ones that really kind of kept things going the way the king wanted a lot of times. But the psalmist says there's no help there. There is no help for us from our rulers, from our leaders politically. They're not going to save us. They're not going to protect us from Satan or any of the other things that are coming around us. There's only so much they can even do. Even if they were to try. I've heard some of the promises, different ones. Well, we're gonna stop the coronavirus. Really? How are you going to do that? You can't even protect yourself from it if it gets you and gets you sick and infected. How are you going to protect us? They cannot. They might want to. Any of us might want to help others and protect others, but we're unable many times. The thing that needs to be protected from is beyond our power to protect. Isaiah 30 and verse 2, he mentions the shadow of Egypt. They put their trust in Egypt. They thought that Egypt would, and that's odd, isn't it? I mean, here Israel had escaped from Egyptian bondage, and now they're going back and putting their trust in Egypt to come rescue them. And he says that's going to be a shame to them. Trusting in the shadow of Egypt will just bring confusion on them. But there were some in Jeremiah's time, Jeremiah 7 and verse 14 tells us that there were some who put their faith in the temple, in the beautiful building. Remember the disciples they were walking and they said, now it was a different temple in Jeremiah's time than it was in the disciples' time with Jesus. But they, look at the beautiful buildings and, how magnificent a structure this is. Jesus said it's all going to fall down. There's not going to be one stone on another. And in Jeremiah's time, before the coming of the king of Babylon, they were putting their faith in, well, we've got God's temple here. God's not going to let anybody destroy us, because if they came in and destroyed Jerusalem and that's his temple. That's where he said he was going to put his name, so we're safe. We don't have a temple, although there are some at times who may think of the church building as so special that as long as we've got the church building, as long as we can come to the church building, then that's going to be good enough, and they trust in that. And I understand there's a certain sense of stability in coming to the same place regularly. But we have to be sure that we don't put our trust in this building or any other building. That's not going to protect us or save us. There were some who trusted in a lie, again in Jeremiah's time. There was a false prophet. His name was Hananiah. And Hananiah lied and lied to the people, and he'd say, oh, no, you're not going into captivity. Everything's going to be fine. You just, peace. And God warned of the danger of crying peace, peace when there wasn't peace. It's a dangerous thing. But Jeremiah was saying, oh no, the Babylonians are coming and they're going to take us into captivity. And you need to not fight against this, because this is what God has decreed is going to happen. And the people said, well, you're a traitor. I mean, imagine, if you will, if somebody today was telling us that the United States is going to fall, and maybe we're going to be taken over by China, or maybe by Russia, or whatever other enemy that they say is going to come take us over. People say, well, that's and then we say, well, and be peaceful and just surrender to them. Well, no, we're not going to surrender. We're going to fight to the last breath to try to defend our freedom and so forth. Well, that's the way the Israelites felt. Jeremiah is here saying you need to just surrender and go peacefully under the rule of the Babylonians. And they're, no, we're not. We're going to fight this. But they were believing a lie because Hananiah was telling them that everything was going to be okay and that they were going to get to stay in the land and all would be good. But no, Jeremiah again and again, he says things like, do not trust in lying words. You make the people trust in a lie. And there are a lot of people today who are out there peddling lies of one kind or another. Religiously, politically, you name it. They're out there peddling lies. And they're getting people to believe and trust those lies. Of course, Jeremiah 46 and verse 25 also warns against putting trust in false gods. How horrible a thing that is, to trust in a God that cannot do anything, cannot even breathe, cannot even live, is just an image. Isaiah 42 and verse 17 talks about that as well. They trust in graven images and say to molten images, you are our gods. And that's not good. There's no help in trusting a false god. Ezekiel 16 and verse 15 hits on something that might hit close to home for some. There he warns the Israelites about how they trusted in their own beauty. You know, our society is very wrapped up in beauty and fashion. And there's certainly nothing wrong with trying to look your best. But if we put our trust in that, if we think somehow that our good looks, I don't have any, so I don't have to worry about putting my trust in that. But if we're thinking that somehow being attractive, being beautiful is going to help us, it's not. Others, Ezekiel 33 and verse 13 warned, were trusting in their own righteousness. And they, putting their trust in themselves, were not wise to do that. Hosea 10:13 similarly talks about those who put their trust in their own way. 2 Corinthians 1:9 also echoing this idea of we should not trust in ourselves. We can't trust our own righteousness, our own way, ourselves. We can't save ourselves. We can't protect ourselves. In John 5 and verse 45, Jesus talks to the people about the fact that they trusted in Moses. But if they'd really listened to Moses and instead of just trusting in him, if they'd have listened to him, they'd have known that Moses prophesied about Jesus. He prophesied about the Christ, the Messiah that was coming. And he says Moses is the very one who's accusing you right now. You're trusting in him, but you're not listening to the things that he wrote and that he said. Philippians 3:4 warns us not to trust in the flesh, in fleshly deeds, in fleshly accomplishments, in our own strength in our flesh, or in our genetics, or in our family history and our ancestry. And Paul warns, you could trust in that. I could brag about mine more than you can, but it won't do any good to put your trust in that. Several passages warn us about trusting in riches, trusting money. And yet the writer of Proverbs points out in one passage that money, wealth, makes itself wings and flies away. Money is one of the most uncertain of things, and yet to put our trust in it, as so many have done, it's a foolish thing. 1 Timothy 6:17 particularly warns those that are rich, those that have money, have wealth, don't trust in uncertain riches. but in the living God. And that, of course, is what we must focus on. And certainly there are many other things that people might put their trust in that we haven't mentioned, but we want to focus now on the fact that trust in God is a must. He has to be our focus. Trust in the Lord or trust in God is mentioned 68 times at least. That's what I found. And that was in the King James Version. It was a few less because they used depend on or have faith in or something like that in some other translations. But in the King James, there were 68 times it was mentioned. In the ESV, it was something like 50-something times, and some others. But still mentioned that, maybe used a different word than trust. I was just searching for the word trust itself to look at. And 68 times. So, maybe it would be a good idea for us to get a list of and go look up those times that trust is mentioned in the Bible. And just go through, read one every morning, a reminder to trust in God. Maybe I'll have to post with the video when I post it. I'll post the list of the verses that mention trusting the Lord or trusting God. Just read one every day. Every morning when you get up, just read that one verse to remind you where you need to put your trust that day, where you must put your trust. In spite of those 68 mentions, we're certainly not going to look at all of those. They're all, a lot of them very similar. Of course, you can read the verses around them to get context. There's often some comparisons and contrasts in there. We just want to consider a few examples. In Job 13 and verse 15, we need to trust God in spite of our suffering. And that's a good one for us now in a time when we've perhaps seen some suffering in our lives. Job says, even though he slays me, even though he kills me, I will still trust in him. In Psalm 56 and verse 3, we're told that when we're afraid, it's a good time to trust in the Lord. Sometimes when we're afraid is the time we take our eyes off the Lord and don't trust him. But we need to trust him when we're afraid. Psalm 64 and verse 10 tells us the righteous trust him. Psalm 71 and verse 5 tells us the youth, the young people, need to trust him. Now, Proverbs 28 and verse 25 may be my personal favorite verse in the whole Bible, because it's the one that says that if I trust in God, he'll make me fat. And since I'm fat, I guess I'm doing a good job. Maybe that's not, you skinny folks, watch out. Hope God will make you fat. But of course, we know he doesn't really mean fat physically, but certainly God will bless us if we put our trust in him. And in Nahum 1:7, we need to be assured that the Lord knows those who trust in him. He knows. He knows each and every one. He knows how many hairs are on their head. He knows how long they're going to live. He knows everything about them. And we need to be one of those that he knows so well and he watches over. Zephaniah 3 and verse 12 commends that the afflicted and the poor need to trust in the name of the Lord. If you're struggling, if you're poor, if you're being afflicted by various things, trust in the Lord. Romans 15 and verse 12 talks about how the Gentiles are going to trust in him, and that's us. We're the Gentiles. And Jeremiah 49:11 encourages the widows to put their trust in God. There are a lot of other things and other times. And in fact, in one passage, what the psalmist says, in all times I will trust the Lord. Whatever the case may be, it's never a bad time to trust in the Lord. And we need to put our trust in him. in addition to trusting Him, trusting what He has provided is a plus. There are certainly some things that we put our trust in that are not dependable because they're not from God. But when God supplies us with something, we can trust that He's not going to let us down with that. He covers us with His wings, and we can trust His wings to protect us. We may not be able to see those wings, but we can know that they'll protect us. Several verses mention His wings. Everything from Psalm 36 and verse 7, talking about the shadow of His wings, to Psalm 61:4, talking about the cover of His wings, to Psalm 91:4, that talks about covering you with His feathers, all the way to Ruth 2 and verse 12, that talks about how Ruth had come to trust under God's wings. We can trust Him to protect us and put His wing over us. We can trust in God's Word. It is solid. It is trustworthy. Psalm 119 and verse 42 says, I trust in your Word. We can trust God's arms. His arms are so strong. Jesus said, no one can take us out of the hand of God. His hand, His arms, so strong that they can hold us, and no power on earth is strong enough to remove us. A godly spouse can be a blessing that God gives. Proverbs 31 and verse 11, a husband of a godly woman can safely trust in her. And what a blessing that can be. God's city, not a physical city, but Zion, the spiritual city of God, that God has provided and has brought all of those who are saved into His city, His kingdom, Zion. In Isaiah 14 and verse 32, tells us the people shall trust that the Lord has founded Zion. And then, of course, God's mercy. Psalm 52 and verse 8, where would we be if we couldn't trust in the mercy of God forever and ever? And so there are many blessings that God has given us that we can trust in addition to just trusting in Him. And I want us to consider now trusting God during dark and doubtful times. It's true, we don't know what will happen. We don't know what events will take place in our lives or the lives of those around us. We can't predict the future with any real ability. We can guess, we can hope, we can wish, all those things, but there's so little that we can actually do. Allison Felix, track star, who maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. She has more gold medals than any other athlete ever, male or female. She broke Usain Bolt's record. She now has 13 gold medals. She said, the most important lesson that I have learned is to trust God in every circumstance. Lots of times we go through different trials, and following God's plan seems like it doesn't make any sense at all. Have you ever been there? It seemed like maybe there was a better way to go, and maybe we should trust something else instead. She said, God is always in control, and He will never leave us. There are times when following God's plan, following God's will, may not seem like it's going to work out. But trusting in Him always does bring us where we need to be. It doesn't mean that trusting God will have no consequences that are negative. In 1 Timothy 4:10, Paul says, for therefore we both labor and suffer reproach because we trust in the living God. So they were laboring, yes, they were working, but they were also suffering because of their trust in the living God. Sometimes our trust in God can actually cause some suffering. It can cause some darkness to enter into our lives. But we must continue to trust Him in spite of that. And there will possibly even be dangerous times when those that we think we can trust, we can't trust. Jeremiah 9 and verse 4, Jeremiah says, "Take heed, every one of you, of his neighbor, and do not trust in any brother. For every brother will utterly stab you in the back," basically, supplant you, betray you, and every neighbor will walk with slanders. Micah also warned of that in Micah 7 and verse 5. Don't trust in a friend. Don't put confidence in a guide. Keep the doors of your mouth from the one who lies in your arms. These warnings that there are dark times that may come, Jesus warned his disciples. Father will turn against son, daughter against mother. A man's enemies will be those of his own household. And certainly we haven't reached any times as dark as that. But they could come. And if they do, our trust needs to be in God. Victor Raymond Edmond said, "Never doubt in the dark what God told you in the light. God has promised, and His promise will not fail. If we will put our trust in Him, He will be there for us." If you're here this morning and you have not put your trust in God, there's no better time than now to start. Perhaps you had your trust in God, but perhaps your trust has wavered because of the swirling storms around you. Like Peter on that stormy sea as he was walking to Jesus, maybe you've taken your eyes off of the Savior. Maybe you've taken your eyes off of God. Get your eyes back where they need to be. And focus your trust on the one who can save you. If you're here and you have a need to respond to the invitation, feel free to let one of the elders know or to let me know, and we'd be glad to pray for you or to help you in any way that we can. And now we'll sing our invitation song.